The final session. In this room, we'll be doing contractual alignment for sustainability, and in the Parkview room, transforming energy. So if you're going to the Parkview room, could you now please leave quietly? Thank you. Excellent. Contractual alignment for sustainability. Bringing global practice to Australia and New Zealand. Contracts drive outcomes is the fastest way to enable solutions to climate change. This panel explores both the challenges and opportunities for Australasian infrastructure by considering the international collaborative practice. Why? Well, because performance is tied to contracts, so by creating a legal space that provides for innovation and improvement, outcomes can be driven more effectively. Your panel today, Kate Raymond. Kate is the National Policy Leader for Australian Constructors Association, and she will also be your moderator. Phoebe Roberts, Senior Associate, Climate Risk Governance for Minter Ellison. Anne Davis, Special Counsel for Clayton Utz, she'll be joining you visually. Nicole Grayson, Chief Executive for Consult Australia. And Marco Misco, Partner, HWL Ebsworth Law Firm. I'm getting the nod, I wasn't sure about that one. He also is going to be joining us on the screen as well. So my apologies there, Marco. So anyway, ladies and gentlemen, your panel.
Thanks. Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you so much. I know it's the last session of the day. We're going to try and keep the energy up in the room and online. So thanks for sticking with us, and hopefully, you're in for a treat with the combined expertise of the panel today. So with me in the room, Phoebe, I'll add to the intros. Phoebe's also a Director, Implementation and Built Environment Project Lead at Chancery Lane Project, a global collaborative effort of over 300 organisations creating new practical contractual clauses to deliver climate solutions in commercial agreements. Nicola, most of you I'm sure know Nicola, who leads Consult Australia's Advocacy and Government Relations agenda in addition to being the CEO. She chairs the Australian Sustainability Built Environment Council's Urban Resilience Task Force and is a member and former chair of FIDIC's Risk, Liability and Quality Committee. Marco, who is online, hopefully, I cannot see Marco on the screen, but hopefully, Marco, are you there? Can you hear us? We don't have Marco yet, and we'll have Anne in about 2 minutes. Excellent, good. Well, we'll roll with the punches today, because that's what we do. Now, I'll assume that you're all contract nerds like us, and you just cannot wait to hear about how we can use contracts and contractual frameworks to drive outcomes, and you won't be disappointed, I know. So I'll kick off the first question while we're waiting for Anne and Marco to join in. Phoebe, I'll throw to you first. What are the key features of an infrastructure contract that are needed to drive sustainable outcomes?
Thanks, Kate. Big question. And also just want to say thanks and hello to everyone. I feel like I'm amongst my people. Everyone who's staying till last session to hear about contracting, so that's really great. So much to say in that. I suppose my perspective is truly that contracts are the biggest sleeper issue in the transition to net zero, and there's a real missed opportunity for all of us in thinking about how we can harness and leverage contracting to deliver to our climate ambitions specifically, but more broadly our sustainability goals. So I look at this from predominantly a climate risk perspective, so looking at contracts as risk allocation tools, fundamentally that's what they are, thinking about how can we allocate the risks of catastrophic physical risk impacts of climate change as we're experiencing at the moment on the East Coast, but also how can we start to implement those opportunities which surround climate change and sustainability and embed those options into contracts. So I think that really when we're thinking about how can we embed sustainability and how can we align contracting, maybe there's two features to kind of kick off the conversation. There's a lot more. One is I really think, particularly if we think about Scope 3 emissions, if we're just thinking about climate change, how else are you going to try and control and reduce emissions that are outside your business fence lines, if not through contracts? And if not through your subcontracting chain and across your value chain in your contractual relations, contracts dictate how we interact with each other in the infrastructure space. And then I suppose secondly, the other thing is thinking about how we can transform the sort of models or mechanisms within contracts to allow for more optionality around sustainability in the long term. So thinking how we can have sort of more teeth around sustainability objectives. So I'm sure many people in the room know what it's like to be scurrying at the end of the project to try and get your points up to get your rating. But think about how we could, embed that throughout the process and to ensure that, owners and principals can actually get those objectives when this might get a bit legally here, but really that there actually are remedies for them to seek if the the sustainability ratings or otherwise of the project aren't being met. So I think that I love talking about contracts. I could sit here and talk about it all day. Maybe I should shut up. But I do really think it's something we should be, bringing the lawyers perhaps on the journey from the very beginning. If you're coming to talk to your lawyer, just at the procurement time when design has already started and commenced and all of that has already gotten underway, it might be a little bit too late, but maybe I'll leave it there.
Nicola, do you want to add anything?
Well, I mean, isn't that interesting, Phoebe, your comment there about coming into the process early, because obviously Consult Australia and ACA, the Australian Constructors Association, we've been talking a lot about the need for reform around procurement and contracting, and talking a lot about the need to engage everybody much earlier in the process, spend more time on really problem analysis and what solution are we going to pick, what is the problem we're trying to solve, what is the opportunity we're trying to reach, and we're talking about the need to get the parties involved more promptly in that process and have that broader collaborative engagement. Very interesting to hear your view that actually we should be including the lawyers in that, because I think in our world we probably wouldn't necessarily have you on that list. I'm so sorry, Phoebe.
we might even think keep the lawyers out.
Possibly take them off. Maybe the point. So really interesting perspective, because yes, there's no doubt about it. In our world, contracts are often the difficult, painful part of the process that we have to go through, and we spend a lot of time arguing over it. How do we turn that contract back into the first principle of it is an agreement between two parties? It should really just be laying out the objectives that you want to reach. And of course those objectives, now we talk a lot about the sustainability objectives, so embedding those in a contract in a way that can enhance those deliverables is really interesting, and something I think would be great to explore on this panel, I hope. But really importantly as well, from the consultant's perspective, is that ability to allow the flexibility for innovation. Because I think, again, what we see too much in the contracting world is that risk allocation of, private sector, it's you taking the risk, it's you, consultant, taking the risk. Now, that doesn't always engender innovation, as we know. It can actually be the antithesis of innovation. So how we open up those contract terms to allow that flexibility, I think, is really, really interesting work. So,
it's a good point about the risk and also the prescriptive nature of the specifications, which is obviously part of the contract. So, in one of the sessions earlier, touched on this point that the prescriptive specification isn't really driving innovation. When, time and time again, it's just the same thing over and over, and even where there's an ability to substitute, you've got, particularly in government projects, there's the risk aversion then from the owner as well to try something new, because what if it fails?
Yeah. Absolutely, and that point about failure is something we really never truly captured, although there may be examples you could draw upon, but I think we do have an inherent fear of failure, and you could argue, well, yeah, quite rightly so, we don't want fundamental failures, but I don't think in our world, we're not really talking about failure being catastrophic failure of, something collapses as loss of life. It's not that extreme. It's the failure of that incremental innovation and allowance for that failure, so that we can learn from that and share those learnings. we need that flexibility, because without that you just inherently create a risk-averse attitude, which then really stymies you from delivering the best you can. And certainly from, again, a consultant's perspective, the consultants love wicked problems. That's what they're there to solve. Many of you will be in this room. That's what you love to solve, those wicked problems. You don't want the contract getting in the way of that. So how do we create that flexibility?
Yeah. And I think just to build on that, there's a few things to pull out. I think one is acknowledging this is really hard. This is really complex, and it's going to take sector-wide, industry-wide collaboration across all different parts of the infrastructure sector, and that it's novel is the other thing, and that means failure. It means it's going to be expensive upfront. There's no doubt about it that there's costs involved in innovating and doing things for the first time, and any lawyers in the room, or anyone who's worked with lawyers in the room, know that they love precedents. We love going back and looking at what we've done, using that, making a few tweaks, and then going forward with a contract that's really similar to one we've used before, because we feel comfortable, and the whole legal system is based on precedent law, but you can't manage unprecedented risks with precedent approaches to risk allocation. And I think if we're looking around at what's happening now in asset resilience, damage, all the projects that are stopped right now, and relying on force majeure clauses that are outdated, you don't get costs for those delays. You're only going to get time under a force majeure clause. And is the flooding and the rain even included, or has the clause been negotiated so much over time that it's not even going to include an event like today? And just to build on that, the science of climate change and our knowledge of the science around embedded, the physical basis for climate change, we know so much more about it, particularly in the last 6 months with the IPCC report, and most recently this week the impacts report that's come out. And to me, that increases the foreseeability of these risks. I think designers and contractors should be looking at the science to think, what's actually more foreseeable now? We're being told what's happening. We already know the state of the science and what's coming in the future, and particularly on different pathways, and how we're baking that into risk allocation. And we're going to look at the most recent contract that we've used to look at risk allocation. It's just not going to work going forward.
Yeah. And I think that there's a balance, isn't there, between there's a desire for an owner to not bear risk. They would like to ideally pay money for someone else to manage that process. But there are some risks that just can't be controlled or foreseen, or if they're foreseen, can't be quantified potentially. Are there any particular contracting methods that you find work better to manage that more fairly?
I'm happy to take this one. So perhaps I can draw an example from the Chancery Lane project. So as Kate mentioned, the Chancery Lane project is a global organisation where thousands of lawyers have come together to collaborate and work together to produce really practical, usable climate clauses that deliver climate solutions in commercial contracts. And the idea being to think how powerful it would be if every commercial contract embedded climate solutions, and what that would mean for sort of the economy. And Anne's just joined us on the line, I can see there.
Oh, wonderful.
And one of the clauses that has been drafted by the teams there, and all of the clauses I should mention are named after children. So Iris's clause is the clause I think touches on this. It's a kind of antidote to force majeure that considers social and environmental impacts of these events that might have adverse impacts because of how the contract is drafted. And I think the example that I think demonstrates this is less of a climate example, but at the start of the pandemic, to think about the planes that were continuing to fly out of airports because they didn't want to lose their runway space, and that would be a breach of contract, and they would have to pay penalties or whatever under the contract. And so all these emissions from all these airplanes that are flying around because they didn't want to breach a contract term, think about, could we not have a mechanism, a more collaborative mechanism where you can come to your counterparty and say, this has an adverse impact on the environment or an adverse social impact, and that we can weigh that up when we come into these events as they arise, and to be a bit more collaborative in that sense rather than the contracts registered.
And collaboration, I mean, we talk about collaborative contracts. A lot of people, you say collaborative contract, a lot of people hear alliance, but there are other ways to collaborate. Are there any innovative ways that you've seen, Nicola, around collaboration between the parties that hasn't necessarily started out under that form? Or
Well, I think a good case study, which a lot of people have been drawing on recently, is the Level Crossing program in Victoria, which obviously was a very good example of a very large project that essentially got broken down into component parts, but it really put collaboration at the heart of it. So it did require all of the people involved in that, all of the project teams to collaborate. And so that, it does fall under an alliance. I guess it was called an alliance, but it's not perhaps the alliances of the past, which we know and many of us love. But it does pick up on that. Essentially, alliance is just another word for collaboration in my mind. It really is about creating those mechanisms that get people talking. So instead of everybody running off to grab the contract out of the bottom drawer to see, well, who's liable for what, it's actually creating that. If there's a problem identification, you have to raise it, you have to have that early warning mechanism. And I think that's what's so key, is to stop people from running to the risk of the liability fallout. Let's make sure we don't get to that point, but let's create that space for someone to put their hand up and say, something is going awry, and I can say that with confidence without being worried that the next phone call that's going to come my way is going to be from the lawyer. So, that's a good example, I think. But, at the moment, we are still seeing, as Phoebe said, a lot of traditional forms of contracts still with the same old sort of broad indemnities and extended warranties. The classic for a professional services contract is fit for purpose. What purpose? If you haven't got a good scope, really you've signed up a disaster of a contract if you've signed a fitness for purpose warranty. So, we still are having these arguments about some of these old forms of liability pass-through without really thinking about, exactly to your point, how do we mitigate these unintended consequences that they drive and stop us from getting those good outcomes that we're all really striving for? Because that's our point of connection, isn't it? We all want to deliver a fantastic product. We all want to make sure that carbon is reduced to the lowest possible form. So, that's what we need to corral around, and that's what we need the contract to direct towards, not pushing us away into silos.
Yeah. And I'll just note, we're joined now by Anne. Hopefully, Anne, can you hear us? Wonderful.
Yes,
Anne Davis, Special Counsel with Clayton Utes. And specialises in procurement of complex infrastructure assets and heavily involved in delivery models, sustainability, including commercial contracts to achieve sustainable outcomes. And welcome to the panel. We're discussing, obviously, contractual alignment for sustainability. We've just had a bit of a chat around some of the key features that can drive sustainable outcomes and some of the different contracting methods that drive these outcomes too, talking about opening the way for innovation. What sort of mechanisms have you seen that have been really effective?
Yeah, sure. Good question. Look, I agree. I was just listening to what my colleagues were talking about and alliancing. And look, I think alliances can be great. One of the issues, though, is that alliances, just before I get onto that question, is that alliances require a big, well-resourced team on both sides. And you don't have that. You don't have that luxury. Unless you're on a really big project, you might be able to get that. But when we're talking about, as I see a lot of the time, these medium-sized contracts, which are just for some hundreds of millions, you cannot have the luxury of that. So you do need to have mechanisms of drafting in the contract, because you're not going to have the big team to be able to get together all the time and talk about every issue. It just doesn't happen. The contractor will have a team, but the principal just won't have those resources. So I think they're all really good points, but I don't think every project can go down that path of that level of collaboration, sadly. So getting to what I think works, it depends on the project, of course, in my experience. One of the things I've seen that works well is an ECI model, and that is the early contractor involvement. That works well, I think, when the scope is difficult to pin down early, because the point made about if you haven't got good scope, you haven't got a good project, is entirely correct. What we're seeing out of the case law is that the courts are saying, look, a lot of these matters that are coming to us are actually scope, not contract. They're issues about what's actually being built. So I totally agree with that as well. So the ECI model allows a period where you can either do it competitively or with one contractor to develop up the scope, the design, etc., in a collaborative fashion. And that can be a really helpful mechanism. Then you either go on with that contractor to build, or you can then they don't propose it, it goes to someone else. So I find that model can be really helpful on more difficult projects which need some early intervention, if you like, not early works in that construction sense, early development.
Yeah, thanks, Anne. And what, I guess, we talked about the carrot and the stick a little bit around there's models that incentivise certain behaviours, and then there's also a need for contractual remedies if someone's not doing what they're supposed to do, and not leaving it to the end to just have sort of an audit at the end, or did you achieve something or not. What sort of mechanisms are you seeing in contracts that actually, drive an approach where the whole supply chain, including the client, can work together as the contract goes to sort of get to the point where you're achieving the outcomes that are desired without sort of it just being at the end, oh, you didn't do it?
Do you want me to say this one? Yeah. A few things. So one thing I'm starting to see more conversation of is really embedding sustainability into the key KPIs and pay and share or gain share mechanisms, and that for me is being driven by the financiers and the funders really because of the rise, and I think you saw the panel today, the rise of sustainable finance and how the financial institutions are thinking about particularly climate risks in project delivery. And one key point I think in that panel that about the long life of assets and the impact that every infrastructure asset is a social asset, I think someone said on that panel, and so the role of finance in these projects, which then weaves itself into the contract, and so just like any other KPI, I think we're starting to see the sustainability objectives or the net zero objectives or carbon reduction objectives to be on par with other performance objectives as well, and then as well to fold it into the pay and share, gain share sort of regime. But there's some more sort of creative, I suppose, ways that some of the drafting teams at TCLP, the Chancery Lane project, have been thinking about sort of providing more teeth, as I said earlier, on these contracts so that the principal isn't in a position where they get to the end of the project and there's no remedy for them if their project hasn't met the specifications that they wanted for their asset, which, things like, increasing the standard of care, which is a touchy subject, so I try not to talk about that one too much, but, increasing the standard of care to capture some of these net zero objectives, and to rate, and as I mentioned before, around the foreseeability of physical risks of climate change, should the standard of care be elevated to specify that in the contract? Because if we don't specify it, are we just assuming that contractors are across these risks? And is it better for it to be out there in the open and the parties to be talking about it, or for us to assume that it's in the standard of due care and diligence that contractors are considering climate risks in how they're designing, consultants are designing the projects and contractors are delivering the project. So some of those types of mechanisms. On a similar topic, another one that I love is a green modification clause. So that's one where either party can propose, and this gets to your point around innovation, either party can propose modifications during delivery, and this is probably only appropriate for those sort of major infrastructure projects that have long delivery times, but that either party can propose modifications that might ratchet up the sort of green specs, reduce emissions over the whole life of the asset, might even just be changes to construction methodology or order of things, and to propose that not just for, modifications or variations that might reduce the cost, but also might ramp up ambition as well on any of those during the life of the project. So if you think about a contractor who might learn something on another project that they're delivering, or they might have innovated in some way to then bring that into their current project and propose that on there as well.
Which a little bit, you mentioned the LXPR before, and it's got that element in it a little bit as well. But I saw your mind ticking away there. When
there are a couple of things that I just wanted to throw in there. The first one being around contractual remedies. I think obviously I'm leaning heavily more towards the incentivisation piece, because if we go too heavily down that contractual remedy piece for default or failure, then we already know we have a significant issue with the insurance market. Professional indemnity insurance is incredibly hard, but we have to take that in the context of what is going on globally for insurers. Insurers are being hammered by climatic events at the moment. They're going to be shelling out, if indeed they are insuring people in Queensland who have been victims of the flood, and our hearts go out to them. Are they insured? Or if they are insured, there's going to be big claims coming the insurer's way. We know, of course, there have been huge claims associated with bushfires. So the insurance market is a market in trouble. There is no doubt about it. So if we overlay that in an environment, in a contractual environment, where then you're creating a situation where your consultants, your contractors don't have the backstop of insurance, then we're potentially going to see market failure in some of the contractors and some of the consultants, because they don't have the assets to bear the cost of the liability. That is a reality we have to face. The insurance market's not going to transform itself anytime soon. We're looking years and years of alteration in the way the insurance market operates. Indeed, the government may find it has to step in more and more. So incentivisation and triggering that good, healthy, competitive spirit in the marketplace to raise standards. So standard of care should come through that, because we should be educating ourselves. We should be, as an industry, and this is where we take some responsibility, I think, as an industry, we have to educate ourselves on sustainability. So we don't need an elevated standard of care, because the standard is that we embody and embrace sustainability principles. So we need to step up as an industry, make sure we're educating in this space, and we are learning from each other, sharing best practice, all of those good things. And we need to make sure that from a standard of care perspective, that we are using that healthy competitive mechanism to drive that through good systems like rating tools.
Excellent. And throwing to you, I'm curious, are you seeing different approaches for smaller projects to mega projects in driving sustainable outcomes, I should say? Of course, there's differences, but yep.
Yeah, of course. No, I know what you mean. So, yes, the larger projects. So one I've recently worked on that reached financial close last year was the North East Link project in Melbourne, and I worked on the sustainability piece in that. And obviously it's a very large project, and it has an ISK rating, green rating as well, etc. It's of a size where it's of course mandated at $1 billion level, and I think this addresses a lot of the issues we're talking about. Effectively, sustainability is contractualised because you've got an ISK rating, and it was worked on really thoroughly during the phase. That was one of the lessons learned, that do a lot of work on sustainability in the piece through the bidders' responses to the rating tool and to what they're going to provide as part of getting their rating, what the elements will be. And there was a lot of work done, and I have to say the client's very happy with that. And so on a big project, I think ISK works really well to drive sustainability. Sounds like I'm marketing for you, and I guess I am. It really worked well. And what I saw in that contract was contractual provisions for a cure period. So if very early on in delivery, like now, we're in year one, first few months of the project, when they're providing the rating information, if the client's not happy with what it's getting and what it's seeing, it can seek more information and try to cure that really early on to get to where it wants to be with sustainability. So there are these mechanisms via contractual clauses, the that allow that process to develop and be collaborative. So it's a wonderful example of a major project which is driving those outcomes. Smaller projects, which is your second part of your question, look, it's a lot harder. I see them wanting to put sustainability in, but if they're a regional project, they struggle because so many of the things might be around materials and methods, and it's just really hard to get the people who can put the methods or the materials out there at a reasonable price that can work with the budget of the local council or the smaller project budget for the state works. So I'm finding it difficult. Hence, here's another plug, and I can't help it because it's true. Essentials is coming up, and I know it's being piloted by ISC, and I think this will be brilliant. So it will get to the materiality issues, the really important issues to the project, and it will make those the centre of the sustainability piece, and hopefully those will be what are considered normally the low-hanging fruit, the easier ones to achieve, and therefore the project will have some sustainability outcomes as well with a new tool for a smaller project, let's say anything from 1 to 100 million, which will be wonderful. I can't wait for it.
Thanks, Anne. I'm curious about some of the related factors to the black and white words of the contract, and how does the project team culture impact on how the contract plays out? Nicola, I'm throwing you first.
Hugely, doesn't it? The culture in the team is so important, and culture more broadly is something that I know your organisation, Kate, cares passionately about, as does Consult Australia. We know that we're trying to move towards a more inclusive, diverse culture, and by doing so, we can do better at unlocking innovation, and innovation leads to dealing and resolving these wicked problems that we have in front of us. So culture and collaboration go hand in hand, don't they? And that's how you increase productivity. Yesterday at an event, the Infrastructure Australia were talking about how, in the building construction sector, we're going backwards in productivity. How can that be when we have our biggest spend on infrastructure in this country that we've ever seen? So, and that's really quite sad to hear, because this is a great industry to be in, and we're all deeply passionate about it. So if we can lean in, I think, on the sustainability side, that is a great call to action for us as an industry, because it really is about creating a legacy for future generation. And that's a strong call to action to help corral that culture and move that culture away from disputes and some of the sort of legacy issues, as I like to call them, that have been hanging around our necks for a long time. And we can move past that by using incentives around climate change. And I truly believe as well we'll attract more of our best and brightest students into this industry if we are shown to be leaders in this space. Because we are being criticised by our young kids in schools about, what is our future going to look like? Now is the time. We're building this infrastructure now, today. So if we don't take this opportunity now and create the culture within these project teams to deliver and have good processes around it, and indeed government policies as well, because we haven't really touched on that, but there's a whole overlay there, isn't there, about is government policy enabling or disabling this? That's how we're going to move forward. Sorry, I've thrown out a load of stuff at you there, Kay. I'm not sure I really answered your question. But
no, you have. I'm sure that everyone out here and online wants to hear about this, because these are the challenges of the industry, and we're an industry with a number of challenges, and every challenge presents an opportunity. So we need to be a sustainable industry in all aspects of that word, and we need to address the culture of the industry as a part of that, and as you say, to be able to attract and retain, how can we be more productive if we can't actually attract the right people into the industry? How can we be more productive if we just spend all of our time fighting over, this word and that word and who owes what? And, we've got to focus on the bigger picture, don't we?
That's it. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. As a lawyer.
I think I'm going to not talk about contracts, which is but I think, I'm just going to put my personal experience around, not to be crude, but there is a war on talent that I suppose everyone in this room is experiencing in the industry, and I have seen a real shift in organisations when there is a pretty singular focus on driving sustainability, particular climate outcomes within their organisation and in their JVs on projects, and what a transformational difference it makes, not just to the sustainability outcomes, but also to the project team's sort of morale and collaboration and how they're working together, and also the purpose that you feel working on something that is values aligned with you. And that's one thing with the Chancery Lane project, which I just can't understate the shift and how rewarding it's been to be part of something collaborative, pro bono, that people who share the same interests as you from all around the world are coming together to collaborate with these on such a global complex issue. And I think without getting on my soapbox here, but climate change, I'm on my box.
You're on your box.
Is that climate change is a completely interdisciplinary, complex challenge that can only be solved by a completely interdisciplinary, collaborative approach to it. And I think, just to touch back on what we were talking about earlier, is how can we fold that into project delivery, and even how do we fold that into contracts, that it is a requirement of project delivery to be looking around and seeing how other projects are doing it, to be sharing the learnings, like particularly on government projects, to be why aren't we sharing the learnings when we all have the same objectives at the end of the day? So like a brilliant project for all of us to enjoy and sustainably into the future. So that, I think, is something for us to all, everyone in the room, to think about as we go forward.
I'm going to go to some questions from the floor, which I've got here, and I'm going to throw this one to you. Question from Georgia: how can lawyers encourage and support clients to be more innovative and less risk averse?
And I'm assuming this is in relation to sustainability.
Sure.
So to be more innovative and less risk averse. Look, show them successful projects. So show them ways where this has worked, because exactly as Kate said, it is working. I've seen a huge change in this space since I started working with ISK in 2009. And I think they weren't even ISK then. It was, green building infrastructure or something. And I've seen a huge shift in the way people are thinking. And it's, as Nicola said, it's about culture. So if people start to see that innovation and sustainability are just what they have to do, they'll do it. And so we've moved out of the periphery, and sustainability, I think, has moved into center stage. And so show people good examples, show people lessons learned, and I think they'll do it.
Can I just build on that?
Yeah.
So the way that we approach it with our clients is that this is about risk, and you need to be addressing the risks to your projects and your businesses, both, as I mentioned, physical impacts of climate change, economic transition risks of your business and the transition to net zero, and what that means for the entity and for the projects that you're delivering. So, what does a squeeze on green materials mean for all of your project delivery? What does a carbon border tariff mean for the project delivery? What does it mean that your clients now have net zero targets they're trying to cascade through to your projects if you're not keeping up? So really it's about the commercial risk element of not addressing these risks and what it means to, proper governance processes within the organisation, and taking a robust risk management approach. And I think a lot of the clients that I work with in construction and infrastructure, they see this as an opportunity, and that's really what this is. Like, yes, they're going to address the risks, and that's why they've got the lawyers on board, and they've got risk management frameworks and all of their internal risk teams on it. But this is, an opportunity of, a lifetime really, to jump on this and get ahead of the game, and to meet the expectations of their funders and clients on this, because they know that it's a competitive edge, and if they don't get on top of it now, they're going to be left behind, because everyone else is sort of like a race to the top at the moment.
Which leads into another question from the floor from Scott, so leading in with constructors often forced to take on too much risk with low margins, impeding flexibility on sustainability inclusions that add cost. How do you make sure that sustainability, or you know, as a lawyer, you can only advise, but what can a client do better, perhaps, a client owner do better to make sure that a contractor has sustainable outcomes front and centre, and that those are costed, and that they're you know, beyond KPIs. We know KPIs can work and incentives work. What can you do to make sure that they haven't priced the job too low and sustainability goes out the door because it's not a must-have?
Yeah, I would suggest, and I think we're seeing a little bit more of this now, that a whole of life carbon approach to the project, and particularly shadow costs of carbon into your project life cycle, and for, you know, all project proponents to be thinking about that from the very early stages of the bid process, and how you are, and that's an economic transition risk, is how much carbon is embedded in what you're proposing to deliver, and then what the shocks will be to project delivery if there is a price on carbon, if, you know, there are squeezes, as I mentioned, on materials you don't have access to because everyone's trying to get the timber, which we all know at the moment. I think that's sort of the next frontier on cost, and what I think is sort of over the horizon for the industry is more sophistication and more sort of transparency on whole of life carbon right from the get-go in the process.
I think also, Kate, it comes back to the value for money definition. How are we really looking at that as a measure, and have we got the right measures in defining value for money? And I would say, certainly, you know, from a lot of perspectives in industry, there's still this feeling that the lowest cost is the way forward. You know, we talk a lot about the race to the bottom. We know it's damaging. We know it's not healthy. It doesn't create a sustainable, vibrant industry. But we sort of got ourselves stuck in this loop because of the way value for money, I think, is defined. Either I think we've got to scrap that term completely, or we've got to accept, no, we need to redefine what value is. Yeah. And value is about sustainable outcomes. It's about the project's objectives. What was the problem? What was the opportunity we were trying to get to? And how are the bidders providing that value? Because yes, there may be more upfront costs, because we all know this, you know, there's a lot of, when we talk about the go slow to go fast, which is, as Anne said, it's taking that time, it's making sure that scope is right. A lot of people hear, that's going to cost us more money up front. Yeah, but in the long term, this is going to come back in dividends. So let's reduce that fear, and let's not get so caught up in this is all about project delivery. We've got the minister's deadline, we've got the minister's announcement on cost. Okay, but we're building this for the next 100 more years in a very volatile environment. So that's what we've got to stay focused on, and that's the value that the teams have got to be able to demonstrate to the client. So I think something the advisors can be doing is helping the client redefine the value piece, and that's going to be critical, I think, in this next few years.
And perhaps also the community to actually start understanding long-term, and that the cost of a project, the cost of a road or a building or other piece of infrastructure is so much beyond the initial upfront cost. We keep talking about, you know, there's a $5 billion upgrade of this highway and this $1 billion airport. The cost is the whole of life of the asset, and if we can start shifting the conversation to what is the cost of the asset over 50 or 100 years, it becomes a much different. It becomes a very different sort of mindset, doesn't it? Yeah. And do you have any views on, we talked a bit about where we're heading and what's over the horizon, on, you know, where do we see contracts and sustainability evolving in the next sort of 5 to 10 years? Maybe that's too far ahead. 3 to 5.
Yes, no, fine. I look far into the future when I can, when we have the time. Look, I know there's let's say, suspicion about contracts and a wish to work collaborative, and I love that too, and partnering and all of that. But look, sometimes you just need a contract, as I said, partly because of project team size or whatever, or the complexity. So I see contractual provisions for sustainability becoming much more sophisticated to, repeat what Kate was saying about all those particular provisions about net zero and carbon pricing, where it exists. I see more sophisticated provisions, and I think they can be a real opportunity. I think they can be really positive because we're not trying to, make the contractor fall over because of them. We're trying to get a better result. So where 10 years ago people would have laughed at me if I'd said we're going to have sustainability provisions with these things in there, right next to where we have, the indemnity and insurance, they would have laughed. Now people are coming around. We're going to see proper sustainability provisions built into the contract, and there will be things that people have to deliver on because all of this can now be priced. Again, in 2009, no one even knew how the economics of it would work. People were saying it can't be done. Now we're seeing it is being done. The Chancery Lane project's doing great work with the provisions they're drafting. They're very climate change specific, which is fabulous. And, that's the big issue. But I think we'll see a range of clauses about sustainability, climate change, all sorts of different things, whether it's particularly about materials in one particular environment or the resources and the team. And ISK can really help with this because they've got, the tool which breaks it all up and tells us what's needed for this piece. So I'm very excited that actually lawyers will be able to be positively involved in this.
Thank you. I've been given the 5-minute wind-up.
Thank you.
It was very polite. One thing that I wanted to pick your brains on while we're here, the role of digital engineering and digital tools in driving sustainable outcomes, and how, we often hear that they're there, they've been there for a long time, they're not being used to their full extent. Contractors often are, afraid of coming forward and sharing information because there's the fear that under the risk allocation that it'll come back to haunt them should something go wrong. Well, they've shared all this information and it'll have a negative effect. What can we do to drive the use of these tools to achieve these outcomes?
I don't mind.
Just a short answer is just capacity building is just needed on every level. I think that's something that is that at all levels of the chain, everyone needs to be brought up to speed on all of this kind of stuff, and it's kind of like that unknown unknowns with this, and even like in enabling tech, and also to incentivise. So I was having a conversation today actually with someone around, a contractor, a tier 2 contractor, just themselves saying we're just going to fork out to upskill our subcontractors because they don't have the capacity to build these systems themselves and feed into our data reporting mechanisms. So we're just going to do it, even though we don't think we should be the ones paying for it, but because we just need to bring everyone on the journey. And if we're going to be setting meaningful, robust net zero targets and reporting against our progress against those targets, we need our suppliers on board. And whether or not that's the right answer about who's paying for it, I do think that's a really big part of enabling transformation and innovation is actually capacity building, learning, and bringing the whole industry on the journey.
Absolutely agree. And there's a couple of things we need to sort out. One is the issue of reliance. Can you rely on the information that's been passed through to you? There's a lot of issues around that. And Consult Australia and ACA have a paper coming out very soon with some solutions, which we'll be happy to share with you. Yes. But that does need to be sorted out in all seriousness. And also in the digital space, I think we've got some work to do around creating a common standard to allow that common ownership. Everybody's trying to reinvent the wheel here around the data and which programs we're going to use, etc. If we can create some sort of common platform, common language, that's going to really help the sharing. Because if we don't share, we're never going to get very far. So, and we have a paper coming out on that too, very soon, don't we, Kate?
All the bases covered.
That's it. But I think there are solutions. I think we know what the answers are. So actually we're in a good place to drive them forward.
I think it was Ainsley who said in a meeting not so long ago, less talky, more do-we.
Exactly.
Yep.
Quite right, Ainsley.
And any final comments from yourself?
In relation to data sharing, look, it's screaming out at everyone that we need to share data. I think how long did it take us to get the geophysical data from in New South Wales into some sort of database? And I think finally that happened, So with respect to data about these things, whether it be water or, whatever data, for example, I know, having worked with water infrastructure people, there's so much data on water and how to get that so that people aren't, as Nicola said, having to reinvent the wheel. We need to share this data. And of course it needs to be verified, before that can happen, because we've seen in all sorts of environments where, if you don't have good data that's been tested, then, it all falls over. So I agree there has to be some sort of concerted joint effort to collaborate in getting data in a very wide form and in a form that people can share. Has to happen.
Sorry, I'll just jump in that absolutely agree. And I think the first thing that I often advise our clients if they're coming to us and they're at the start of a sustainability or net zero journey, and it's one way that you can start to embed the optionality with sustainability into your contracts today without impacting on risk-return ratios too much, is to start collecting data and start taking your suppliers on the journey around collecting consistent data across various metrics, because for many reasons, when the rubber does hit the road and you do need to start demonstrating this in your tender responses, but also to your financiers or on the next project where the dial has shifted significantly on what the expectations are around those metrics, you're already in a position where you've taken steps to do that. It's something you can do right now, and you can always ratchet that up over time, and it's something that's quite easy to do that can really set you in good stead over time to think about how you can take it on with you.
Well, I think that's great to leave on something that you can do right now. There are a few things I think we've discussed today in this panel that can be done now, and hopefully we will see greater collaboration, greater information sharing, more consistent use of data and better sustainable outcomes. So thank you. If you could join with me in thanking the panel today. It's been a really interesting discussion. Thank you so much.